So hey anime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Teleported in Rwby? So let's start the series. This self-described rabbit goddess, Otsutsuki God, swatted Naruto away, causing him to scream. The ground collapsed on top of him, shattering him and sending him trembling. With every bone and nerve imploring him to rest and stop moving, the blonde flinched as he stood. Nevertheless, he disregarded such cries and concentrated on returning to the battle because he was a formidable and unyielding individual. He had a glimpse of his Naruto friend being slammed down next to him as he looked up, but he rebounded in midair and landed on his feet. Both were breathing heavily and were barely able to continue as they were. Because they were unable to touch her simultaneously, Otsutsuki God would prevail at this rate. Damn it, Nine Beast, you have any ideas? No, wait. Maybe I do. It will take a few minutes though, and you might be in even worse pain than before. At this rate you'll take pain over this bitch winning. Get to the tree, they'll take over from there. See if the Uchiha can get you a few minutes. Got it, NRDO friend? I'm right next to you, you idiot. What is it? Naruto put up his palm as the brooder winced and turned to face him. He was aware of its meaning. 5 minutes? No problem. The victorious Avenger sprouted his Susanoo and rushed back into the battle, just as before. Naruto turned and headed straight toward the god tree, the Shinju. There were only a few flowers surrounding the base when he arrived, and if he hadn't known better, he would have thought it was lovely. The sage placed his palm against the tree and said, "Okay, Nine Beast, you're up." Then he let Nine Beast do his thing. While his mother was preoccupied with the Uchiha during the period when the two reincarnations were separated, Zetsu was attracted to the Uzumaki's lack of aggression. He noticed him standing at the base of the Shinju, barely touching it, when he looked across the field. He was perplexed at first, but as his bond with mother waned, he realized that brat is trying to unseal the Biju. How could he possibly know how to do that? Zetsu yelled, "Mother!" The Uzumaki, diverting Otsutsuki God's attention from his Naruto companion. Taking advantage of the situation, Indra's reincarnation swiftly removed the arm concealing Zetsu. A new arm emerged from the socket, and Otsutsuki God snarled and let out a little scream as her arm flew to the ground. "You insolent child, don't you see I'm trying to help?" the rabbit goddess said, narrowing her eyes. Before his friend could respond, she flew at him and landed a right hook into his jaw. Then, she grabbed his hair with her left hand and attempted to throw him in the opposite direction. But as soon as she touched him, he lopped her hand off and inserted a kunai into his. He had to dodge before her sword-like elbow cut his head as it disintegrated to dust. Naruto, whatever you have planned, hurry the fuck up. Nine Beast slid out of his meditation position and moved to his container, shrinking to the size of a horse. Kit, I'm almost done. This is going to feel like hell, but it should be quick. Gonna be honest with you, Naruto. I don't know if you'll see me again after I'm done. What I'm doing could be considered treason against higher powers, though Otsutsuki God is higher on that list than me. The most powerful of the nine sat on its rear thighs. Figures emerged as lights flashed over the mindscape. Gyuki, Saiken, Shomei, Goku, Kokuo, Shikako, Matatabi, and Isabu. They simply drifted in as if they had never been there before. Naruto grinned broadly at each of them until he realized what Nine Beast had told him. Wait, what do you mean, never see you again? Nine Beast stared down without responding. Before he could sense what was happening, Gyuki looked around. Naruto, I suggest you brace yourself. Before a scream tore through his throat, the word "why" was on the tip of his tongue. As if to ease the strain on his central energy pathways, he suddenly collapsed where he was standing, alternating between clutching his head and falling down flat in the fetal position. In the hopes that they might at least try to help him manage the anguish, Matatabi and Saiken rushed to him. Even in his mindscape, Saiken's sensation of his body temperature produced bubbles that seemed to function on the outside as well. Nine Beast only gazed sorrowfully at his host. After this, he was aware of what was ahead. One of the gods, the actual gods, would probably descend upon them and take Otsutsuki deity away for punishment once they murdered or resealed him. At least he trusted Naruto to keep his siblings safe. In his pain-induced haze, the host who was supposed to hold all 9 Biju turned to face 9 Beast. He spoke to Gyuki for a few minutes before the 8 Tails nodded. He gently stroked Matatabi's flame-like fur while holding his hand up against her. Even though it seemed to go on forever, the agony had significantly decreased after a short while. He simply laid there, constantly caressing the Nakomata as a dull, agonizing ache echoed within of him. In the real world, Naruto awoke after 2 minutes. His body ached, but not as much as it had. Besides, he felt whole despite the pain. Even after the elderly guy gave him that unique core energy, he was more energized than he had ever been. Even though they all knew she was playing with him, he watched his friend Naruto just surviving against Otsutsuki God, and the roar of lightning rang in his ears. Even when he infused his Kusanagi with lightning core energy, the rabbit goddess was simply irritated by his punches and slashes. She wasn't expecting it, so yes, he hacked off her hand and arm, but she was even more angry now than she had been before. The blonde's inner energy surged, and Naruto's companion hoped that whatever it was would be completed soon. Despite his strength and arrogance, he was aware that he would die at this rate. But as he battled her, he realized something. It appeared as though Otsutsuki God needed to exert more force into her sidesteps and more effort into her blows. It felt as though she was becoming weaker. With a small widening of the eyes, Naruto's companion glanced over the woman's shoulder to the blonde by the tree. "You brilliant fucking idiot." The Otsutsuki God herself was perplexed. She saw her power gradually being drained, but she was not of how. As she sidestepped, she thought about it and realized that moving away from Indra's attack required more energy than usual. She could see that he was growing weary from the relentless attack, but she kept dancing around his blows, knowing that she would be there to pick up where he left off as soon as he stopped. When Otsutsuki realized what was happening, her eyes opened like a slap across the face. She could hear Zetsu's words well. She caught her friend's left heel in her cheek due to a moment of distraction. The Uchiha only needed that to get a second wind. After deftly putting the blade back in its scabbard, he turned around and struck her in the nose with his right hand. He walked on the air, slid behind the former queen, and kneed her head, snapping it forward, using his newly acquired ability to fly. In an attempt to catch the Uchiha off-tempo, the goddess let out a cry of frustration and threw out her elbow. He watched the bone drop from her elbow and took a stride to the left, reaching her right side, thanks to the force of Red Eye. She swung her arm around to chop off his head before he could try anything. His pal nearly gave up when he gazed up at her. The emotionless, once regal visage was filled with an awful rage that was focused only at him. She squatted down a little and began running in his direction. He used it as a kind of buffer between them, thinking fast as he flew through the seals for the Chidori Iso. He didn't have to wait long until Naruto materialized next to him. "Wait, what?" Naruto's friend asked, glancing to his right at the blonde who had seemingly materialized out of thin air. His name pierced his thoughts. "I can't sense him, like he isn't even here. But, his core energy, it's too damn bright. Sorry about that. It was more painful than what was described to me." Even though he was breathing heavily, the Avenger scoffed and said, "Nothing I couldn't handle, unlike you." His response was a smirk. "This idiot," Naruto's companion said, stealing another look at him, "is exuding strength and confidence." "What the hell, Naruto?" Naruto maintained his focus on the goddess Otsutsuki, who was panting a little and may have been a little erotic if they hadn't been attempting to murder one another. "All right," Naruto said, "this is it, Otsutsuki God. And honestly, I think that if you weren't so determined to kill everyone, we could have been friends." Otsutsuki God gazed, his eyes narrow. Insert adrenaline shine down. With a gentle breath, the sage's entire manner abruptly transformed. The foolish blonde who was constantly hurrying in was no more. A serious shinobi now stood in front of her, determined to put an end to the battle, probably in any way he could. A few of the ninja who were awake likened the appearance to Minato's entry into combat. A moment after Nerda's eyes sprang open, he was standing in front of her, slamming his fist into her face. Her eyes widened as the blow sent her hurtling. In an attempt to catch up, the blonde crouched and shot off after her. The Otsutsuki god screeched to a stop and straightened herself. She reached out to him and swung her fingers at him like bullets, but Nerda only dipped and moved aside. He vanished just as she was about to try using additional bones from her Shikatsu Miyaku. She got a horrible realization at that very moment with Nerda's pal off to the side. My red eye's power, it can't track him. Nerda kicked her in the side from behind, causing her to fall to the ground. Otsutsuki deity coughed, leaped off the ground, and stood as quickly as she could. He was more powerful than her, since that blonde youngster had stolen the Shinju's power. Here, she was the goddess. The child is not spoiled. The child immediately landed on top of her with a heel kick, forcing her head to the ground once more before she could respond. She twisted in an attempt to push his feet out from beneath him as soon as she felt the ground against her cheek. Nerdo felt himself fall, but he leaned back and performed a backflip to get himself back up. When he retreated, Otsutsuki god saw something in him. The garment that represented his relationship with that beast was not being worn by him. It was all him. That notion made her feel a little afraid, but she quickly smothered it. She would not allow him to even attempt it. When she extended her hand and sent the blonde hurtling with a Shinra Tensei, her Rinnered Eye's power surged. The sage swiftly hit the ground after slamming into a rock formation and was moving in her direction once more. This woman. I have to get Nerda friend near her quickly. She needs to be resealed and fast. Nerda friend, you ready? Asked the Avenger, who was still in shock but soon realized what was going on. With a nod, he began to approach the Otsutsuki god. Before she had to dodge from another fist aiming at the back of her head, she pivoted, hit the Uchiha a few feet away, and slammed the fist aimed at her stomach away. Before Nerdo exploded into smoke that obscured her eyesight, she threw out her left elbow and hit him in the gut. When he attempted to kick her again from above, her Byakugan swiftly flared in pursuit of him and backstepped. Behind her, she observed the Uchiha hurling the lightning sunban. When the sage threw his own kunai at her from the side, she had to pivot and use the Rinne Red Eye's power to absorb the core energy. The god Otsutsuki was panting. She had never had to relocate so much. The others either moved away from her or died. Nerda nodded and bumped his fist out, saying, Kit, I can spare a bit more core energy, but after this I'll have to rest again. Nerda's power, which was already high, soared again as they made contact with fists. He couldn't concentrate on the fact that his cloak was different this time. In order to seal her, Nerda zeroed in on her and drew her nearer to his companion. The blonde's second blow nearly sent Otsutsuki god's head flying from its perch, but she had to dodge the first one. After snapping to the left, it used his speed to spin and give her a roundhouse kick to the side, which caused her to skid back even farther. With as much lightning core energy as he could conjure, Nerdo's friend was right up on her, shocking her beyond belief. Otsutsuki god's body convulsed and froze, but despite her best efforts, she was immobile and inside accepted her fate. Done in, by my own grandchildren. Nerdu placed his palm against the Otsutsuki god while sliding with his comrade. It was strange. Despite his happiness, a part of him screamed in grief. He saw the smile on the white-haired princess's face. The ground gathered around her body as she started to rise in the air, attempting to create a new prison on the moon. You? Nerdu and his friend turned to see the Otsutsuki god's severed arm, but the black Zetsu was writhing inside its sleeve. After exchanging glances, the two reincarnations nodded. You wanted to be with your mother, right? Nerdu approached him, and Zetsu felt a shiver of anxiety. Nerdu came over to him and took his arm. Well, he said, pulling his own arm back and flinging it in the direction of the emerging moon. Join her. I'll kill you, Uzumaki, Uchiha. Just you wait. The battle between the goddess and the other shinobi in the country came to an end with that terrifying cries. End of song. Nerdu was conflicted as he gazed at the new moon. He shook his head, even though he knew it had to be done. No, nothing more could have occurred. All of them would have been slain by her. As he was ready to thank his friend, he turned to face him. But he saw the expression on his friend's face. He was envious, just like all those years before. Nothing. Naruto friend. Naruto friend. No response once more. Before Naruto could call out to him again, his friend's hand moved, and he turned to face him and said, Kamui. He had no intention of moving, he was dragged into the dimensional rift and vanished from this world. He heard the guy mumble, I'm sorry, Naruto, before he was completely gone. Change in scene. His body ached as the wind blew past his face. That was eliminated by the enhanced healing factor from possessing the 9 Biju, not because of the combat. His body seemed to be gradually attempting to alter his core energy, but it resisted. The Biju was yelling and calling his name, but he was unable to respond. He had no idea how long he was falling, but he was certain that hitting ground would hurt. In the jungle, the sound of earth shifting from force could be heard. And when you witness a body falling from the sky, you have to at least go and rescue it, even though typically you would just brush it off as a vengeful grim. One Crow Branwen was out with a class that day, which was fortunate for the body. After taking a gulp from his flask, he turned to his assistant and said, Take them back to Signal, I'll be back soon. Tell Rwby and Young to wait for me after classes. He then leaped out into the wilderness to look for the accident site. Given that it was a sizable crater in the middle of nowhere, finding the location wasn't too difficult. He proceeded to the hole's edge and slid through it to get close to the body. He quickly checked to see whether there was any damage and found nothing. So he grabbed the boy and left the area. Right now, he had no desire to combat Grim. A few days went by in the real world. But it had been weeks for Naruto. Time flow in his mindscapes was both a boon and a bane. He had to adjust to the sensation in comparison to core energy, but it did assist him in receiving an explanation from his inner companions about what was going on. In a brief sense, it was the same, but its effect differed from its potential. To begin with, he developed a skill that he considered to be just as powerful as the Biju's Bijudama. Like the cloaks his friends gave him, it too felt like a protective coat running the length of his body. Thankfully, his companions were also unharmed by the conversion and continued to feel normal. So he did what he always does with the time he had. Take a train. He trained his mind to employ his new skills, which are more mental than physical, even though they weren't as physical as push-ups or jogging. Unfortunately, when his body started to awaken, his training came to a stop. He scowled slightly as he looked around the room. Stupid hospital. Ah, you're awake? Naruto turned to face the voice and noticed a person who reminded him of Rwby. Expecting this man to be a racist as well, the woman's ears drooped slightly as she saw him staring at them, but, kawaii. The gentle call of her patient drew her attention back, and she turned to see him up and about to rub her ears. She was a medium-height woman, perhaps 5 feet 6 inches, with brown hair that fell to her shoulders and a doctor's coat. Other than the fact that she had 2 cat ears on top of her head that twitched occasionally, she didn't seem particularly strange. Naya, please, the denial was crushed as she felt his fingertips caress the base of her ears. She soon started purring, but that had to stop abruptly when the door opened and a man entered who, according to his acquaintances, had the same signature as the person who had brought him here. Expecting to see the nurse replacing the 4 on his wrist, Crow opened the door, but when he found the man standing there, scratching the faunus nurse on her ears, he was at a loss for what to do, so he turned on his heel and walked away, as he often did in embarrassing circumstances. Reluctantly, the half-purr-induced comatose nurse moved away from him and said, Sir, please, I'll need you to sit back down and let me run a couple tests. All she received was a blank gaze. Nani? What? Naruto blinked twice and asked his friends what to do, but they also came up blank. Matatani suggested that they bump fists with her, so he did, or tried to. When Naruto held his fist out for the nurse to bump, she just stared at him like she didn't know what to do, so he made the motion of bumping his own fists and holding it back out. The nurse wasn't sure how this would help, but she did it anyhow. They didn't anticipate being drawn into his mental world. The nurse flew back onto her, but when she saw the 9 enormous figures, she knew they weren't grim because of their non-black-white coloring, but that didn't make it any less terrifying for her. The giant blue cat-like figure, which she liked, approached her slowly, and despite her instincts telling her to flee, her fear of them prevented her from doing so. She noticed her patient giving the cat a really expression as she sensed another presence behind her. "Please don't, Matatabi." The nurse glanced at her patient and said, "I get you. I can feel the terror she's putting out." Naruto blinked as he glanced at her. "Oh, that makes sense too," he said. He looked back at the enormous cat and said, "Thanks for the idea, Tabi-chan." The enormous cat chuckled and said, "Kitties know how to talk to one another, Naruto-kun. Hopefully I will be able to understand the other people too." In his mindscape, the sage turned to the nurse and helped her up, saying, "Hello, I'm Naruto, and I'm sorry, but Naruto's expression changed to one of seriousness, and the nurse thought she was in trouble for something she didn't know. You seem a little pale." The tense atmosphere was broken at that moment, and the blonde held a small watering pail in his left hand. He laughed at the expression on her face and willed the pail away, to the groaning giants behind her, though they could tell she was less afraid. They left the Biju alone after saying, "Thanks for the help everyone, but I think she'd feel better out in the real world." The blonde was grinning at the nurse when she opened her eyes. "I'll have to beg that you keep that a secret, Annie?" She nodded blankly. No one would believe her anyway. She had to go get that crow guy anyway, he was responsible for him since being brought in. She turned and left. Naruto silently waved, and when the door closed he frowned. When she was brought to the mindscape he didn't mean to, but he saw some of her memories. Just like me, huh? After a minute, the door opened and the man who had allegedly brought him in entered with a blonde girl about his height, dressed in bike shorts, a yellow tank top, and a brown leather jacket. A smaller girl with black hair and red highlights, wearing a black and red shirt and matching battle skirt, followed by a red hooded cape, came in behind her. "Hello, child. I'm Crow." To get down to the point, "What the hell happened to you?" The blonde girl slapped the back of his head as soon as he finished speaking, and he'd scared and muttered something about being old enough to swear. The little girl just looked at Naruto curiously and said, "Gotta agree with old man here." Crow, the man, was now in a corner, using a stick from somewhere to draw circles in the floor. "Uzumaki Ndu is my name. And I don't know where I am." "I wouldn't have believed you if the nurse hadn't told me you were speaking another language 5 minutes ago," said Crow, who was back on his feet and had a serious expression in his eye. The blonde and short girls were surprised. "I'm going to attribute it to some aura strength from wherever you're from, though, given that she informed me you bumped fists and miraculously learned how to speak ours." He slightly loosened his posture. "So, I'll do you a favor and tell you a little bit of the history, and you tell me yours. Does that sound good?" Coming up short on information wasn't good for a ninja, so he had to take advantage of it. Naruto thought in silence for a while. He knew a little bit about what had been going on from that nurse's memories, but not much more than that the land was called Remnant, the faunas were discriminated against, and there were beasts that plagued the land that looked like animals called Grim. Naruto put out his fist and said, "Okay, I'll bite, but it will be easier this way. We can take as much time as we need if we talk like this." Crow's eyebrows went up, but he then gave Naruto a fist bump, and his mind was blown. Naruto showed him some of his memories that matched the stories he had told him about how he got to Remnant, and he decided that he should only show Crow these things because he had seen what it was like to be in a war, even if it was against animals. Crow then filled him in on the places he was missing, including the kingdoms, their leaders, the military, to a certain extent, hunters and huntresses, and the school that was training them. "Well, Naruto, that is quite the story," Crow said with a small sigh and a smile. After a moment outside, the two girls with Crow broke apart, and they only saw something in his eyes when he brought them along to visit that old man Ironbutt. It was something like kinsmanship, like a teammate and fellow fighter. The sage grinned at the Crow and said, "Thank you, Crow. Based on what I saw, my only option is to assist you in adjusting. I suppose you can see how important it is to me." "Well, introduce yourselves to your new housemate," Crow said, turning to the girls while continuing to smile. The blonde girl yelled, "What the fuck? You said absolutely nothing. You simply touched his fist, and now he's staying with us and your friends?" Crow turned to her and saw the serious look back in his eyes. Young. Believe me. That was all she needed to do, and she fell silent once more. Naruto glanced at the other girl with them and locked eyes with her. He knew she had a lot of power in her, and when he looked into her eyes, he clammed up a little. "You have silver eyes," he said, his voice catching their attention, and they saw that he was staring at Ruby's eyes. "You have silver eyes." Crow's eyes widened slightly, wondering if Naruto could feel the power of that. No, he couldn't, he was only just brought here. He doesn't even know the legend. He'll have to speak to Ashbin soon. He was thinking about Naruto's abilities, and he would be in Beacon in no time. Ruby flushed a little because no one had ever looked at her eyes like that. Thanks. Yang, on the other hand, used this as a chance to make fun of her sister, even in front of Crow. Ooh. Is the adorable blonde here the object of little Sis's affection? Ruby and Naruto both blushed, but Crow appeared a little irritated and amused. He could already sense that a strong link was being formed. 6 months later. After escorting Naruto to the house he shared with his nieces, Crow asked him if he wanted to learn anything other than kunai and other ninja weapons. Thinking that it would be beneficial to learn about various weapons, he accepted the offer and immediately fell in love with Crow's scythe. The way it curved menacingly called to him, or perhaps it was the 9 inside of him telling him it was badass and that he should make his own. He made a hybrid scythe/assault rifle. It is said that signal students make their first weapon, which is true, but some, like him and Rwby, made theirs before their final year. Since they were the same age, they were placed in the same classes in year, and Rwby didn't mind because she and her uncle as well as Yang had become close to Naruto, more so than Yang and Crow, though. They all made similar weapons, and that, along with the fact that they were in the same classes, made friends with each other, though Naruto seemed to be better at it and had an unholy love of cookies. Naruto sobbed when he discovered there were no noodle shops, and he had to find a substitute somewhere. The first weapon Naruto chose was a scythe, which he named Shingetsu, New Moon. When asked why, she blushed slightly and said, "After every new moon there's a crescent." This was also her way of telling him that she would always be right behind him, supporting him when he needed it. She was a little upset when Crow was teaching them and he seemed to just absorb the knowledge and almost always executed a move flawlessly. If he remembers correctly, Naruto saw Crow cry and mumble something about having to work forever and he sees it once and does it the first time. It goes without saying that he wanted to create another weapon to learn more about. He chose to call it Writer Palish since it resembled a rapier and had a pistol integrated into the handle. While he was creating it, Crow shook his head and muttered that he was supposed to be learning about cashing a favor. "God kid, you sure can give me a workout," Crow said, letting out a final, deep breath. Considering how old Crow was, it was surprising. That being said, "I did say that I would tell you what I mentioned about your rapier," Naruto replied, rolling his eyes. "I couldn't help you because I work with my scythe and its forms. But do you recall what I told you about old Ironbutt? Ironwood was given a nickname by his nieces, which Crow liked. You mentioned that he was instructing the other heiress, correct?" Naruto nodded. Weiss, the ninja nodded and said, "I'm guessing that since you're too lazy to come with, you're sending me out alone to learn with her." He sensed Crow's sheepish head scratch. "Right, well she is using a rapier-like weapon as well, I guess you can see where I'm going with this." As Naruto moved forward slightly and whispered, "That's actually okay, but my question, do Yang and Rubes know?" He didn't want to hurt their feelings, maybe making them think he was never coming back. Yang was like a sister to him and Rwby, while he didn't know honestly. He couldn't describe it but it felt like maybe there was something there. He wasn't good with relationships. Especially when he didn't see the blatant sign of Cheyenne asking him to fuck her, as pointed out by Shikaku. It made the situation worse when Crow and Yang both looked at him and Rwby playing a game on the TV one day shoulder to shoulder, and told the two, "We approve, just use dash," and then get cut off by Rwby using her speed semblance to push them away. Naruto laughed and spoilt them by saying, "Yeah, they do, and they told me to tell you that you better bring them something nice back from Atlas. Ah, before I forget, what is it you wanted to show me? The sage tensed a little, but decided it was time to make amends because Nirda had omitted all information about the Biju from the first demonstration of how he arrived to Remnant. He bumped into Crows and stuck out his fist, nearly falling when he opened his eyes again. An hour later, Crow and Nerdu were waiting for the ninja's ride to Atlas at an airship docks. Crow quickly came to terms with the fact that Nerd had Biju in him, which wasn't difficult given all the other crap he was exposed to. Nerdu, when you meet the heiress, go easy on her. Crow, displaying his tender side, said of Weiss, Winter, well plainly put I don't like her, don't hate her, but I definitely don't like her. And I have a strong suspicion that the father of Winter and Weiss might also be involved in that. Nerda nodded after giving the now apparently older man a quick glance before the airship arrived and took him to Atlas for his training. A few hours later, when he landed, he kissed the chilly ground. Someone on the flight had been having some bad thoughts and drew a small murder of Nevermore to the ship, and they wouldn't let him do anything, not even man a gun. Some of the shots got a little too close for comfort from the surrounding craft, but they managed to get through it. So you must be Nerda. Ninja nodded his head and extended his hand, not wanting to unintentionally bring him in like that nurse lady. Nice to meet you, he said, getting back up when he heard a cough. He saw a man about Crow's age wearing a slightly different version of the Atlesian military uniform. General Ironwood. Crow described Ironwood's appearance to him, saying it would have been terrible otherwise. The general took the hand and briefly searched Nerda's eyes for something before removing it and grinning, saying, I think I'm going like you, kid. They started to walk inland toward a particular building, which had a large field with obstacles and an arena that was obviously designed for challenges. A girl with pure white hair and an off-white/blue dress was running the course, and she was incredibly fast, almost as fast as he was without a couple of the seals he had to set. After nearly killing Crow in a spar, he realized he needed to limit his power, and he whistled softly. A piece of advice for you, kid, don't let her catch you, Ironwood said, believing he was whistling at Weiss rather than the task she was doing. The general looked at the blonde and said, oh yeah, he was going to have fun teasing this kid. She may be used to the suitors and such, but it definitely doesn't mean she likes it. Nerdu blushed and stammered out that he wasn't looking at her like that, though in reality he was. I'm just impressed at how fast she is going. Alright, that's her resemblance. Glyphs. She is capable of creating many ones. Contrary to popular belief, she didn't despise Faunus because of her father and the way the company operates. Elemental if she infuses dust with them, or even the speed ones she's using now. Their conversation ended when she completed the course, took a breath, and turned to see her instructor and a blonde boy with thin whisker scars on his face. When she approached them, Weiss greeted her teacher and sized up the blonde, and he did the same. After a moment, he held out the sword and asked to see hers, so she took Mertenaster from her side and they briefly exchanged weapons. She glanced at his waist and noticed a rapier that was somewhat similar to her own. Nerda caught her eye and carefully removed Reiter Palish from his waist. When Nerda noticed the dust canisters on the side of the weapon, he nodded respectfully. He should have done that with his own, because he had learnt a lot more about the world since being taken in. Similar thoughts were running through Weiss's mind. The rapier she was holding was a self-made weapon, as evidenced by the small, unintelligible inscription near the handguard. She lifted the grip, examined the pommel's position, and deduced that it could be adjusted to allow dust to be fired from the barrel along the blade. You know, I wish I had thought of using dust cylinders instead, Nerda grinned as the two turned back to face one another and returned the guns. I can't add elements to mine, but I have aura to spare, Weiss said, glancing at Ironwood, who gave her a little nod, a sign they put up for potential suitors. A nod indicates they're okay, while shaking indicates she has something else to do. I actually had that thinking when I was having it manufactured. When combined with my appearance, it might be over in a matter of minutes. As a ninja, Nerdu was able to pick up on the faint undertones of conceit in her statement, but he was unable to respond because it might also be true. Ironwood went forward and said, "This is Nerdu Uzumaki, Weiss." Weiss arched an eyebrow. He will be studying the fundamentals of rapier combat as a favor to a dusty old crow. Why simply the fundamentals? Naruto made the point, well, I need a stable format to form my own style. The heiress gave him a somewhat surprised look, as rapier combat had been the same for a while. Perhaps it was time for a new style to emerge, and people would undoubtedly figure out a way to counter it if she never had to fight another. Weiss waited weeks before asking for help, and this lad. Naruto just grinned, yeah, I have no problem with that. Ironwood raised his eyebrows this time, thinking ahead. Okay, I'll help too if when you're finished with it you teach me too. Yes, the common thought, darling Weiss would benefit greatly from this. 3 weeks later, 2 months. In the nearly 3 months that have passed, a lot has happened. Like Crow, Naruto absorbed the information from the general and heiress, and because he was picking things up quickly, he decided to share a little bit about himself with them, not his past, but just a few things here and there, and he had already begun teaching Weiss some of the moves to the style he had in mind. Being a ninja, he was nimble, and Weiss was already quick, so he thought she would benefit from it, though it was awkward at times. When she stumbled or lost her balance, Naruto was always there to correct her or catch her. When she failed to make a move correctly, Naruto took her back to his front and performed the motions loosely again, often observing her blushing afterwards and not understanding why. Even after learning about Cheyenne from the Biju, he still had no idea what romantic feelings were. However, today was not a training day, rather, it was Weiss's test for admission to Beacon Academy. Naruto was informed about Beacon and its headmaster Ajban. He will have to wait and see what transpires. He didn't feel good about her test, but it wasn't because she failed, he had complete faith in her, but rather because there was someone in the room who exuded evil intent, which he couldn't identify without entering Nine Beast Sage mode, and he didn't want that chaos just yet. Ironwood and Weiss's father were silently watching Weiss next to him, and as Crow had predicted, Naruto didn't like him because he always assumed the holier-than-thou attitude and held Faunus in a completely shite light. Spectators of Atlas, both Faunus and human, were dispersed throughout the room, and Mr. Schnee wasn't so bigoted that he couldn't stop them from observing or strutting. Everything was going well until the Elysian Knight she had been scripted to fight sidestepped, swung its sword over her head, and slashed her to the ground. The knight's sword blade sliced her over her right eye vertically, just missing her actual eye and slicing the skin above and below. Blood seeped out slowly and soon dribbled down her chin. Weiss flinched lightly as she stood, but she quickly overcame the surprise of being stuck and used her glyphs to dash around the knight and strike at the area on his back. Before long, the metal man was down and rendered inoperable. The moment was interrupted when Weiss felt someone walking to her with something. A quick glance up at the booth that held her father, teacher, and friend revealed they thought it was strange, and Naruto himself was no longer smiling. Weiss sat out of breath and looked up at her father, who was stoic as usual, Ironwood smiling lightly, and Naruto simply beaming at her, swearing she saw a sparkle on his teeth. "Daiyu Schnee bitch," she said, glancing at the man who was approaching and becoming terrified when he ran toward her and raised his hand, the serrated blade of the knife gleaming in the dimly illuminated room. She had to move. She was tired, but she had to move. Weiss's body resisted her and ultimately prevailed, but it didn't matter because just as the would-be assailant had come within 5 feet of her, a white-gray light beam struck through him, sending him flying across the room. Looking to her left, Weiss noticed Naruto a few feet away with a face devoid of emotion, his hand outstretched like a gun, and a strangely shaped floating skull behind him. She put the pieces together and let out a shaky breath, and Naruto helped her up. The other Ironwood students went to their training ground, where they had set aside a place to rest when teaching her the new style. This place was in the rafters, out of the other room occupants at the time, and Naruto had placed a ladder leading up to it so that Weiss could easily reach it. When they arrived, they saw what appeared to be a room with a set-up table and chair, a couch, and a white TV. Naruto sat Weiss down on the couch and sat next to her, knowing that near death isn't the best feeling. He had sensed the hatred that man had been releasing, but it was so thick that he couldn't identify it. When he finally made his move on Weiss, the sage felt the source and had to move. He would have released the seals, but he didn't have the extra few seconds, so he decided to jump down to the arena, somewhat surprising Mr. Schnee. The reason he didn't use his semblance was because it either killed someone or put them on the path to death. He was as good as any chunin, even as a ninja, with all the seals on him, but it wasn't enough, so he settled for things the other way. He raised his hand like a gun and took aim just ahead of the attacker, then recoiled his hand as if he had just fired a gun and heard the telltale sign of his semblance form and fire behind him. Weiss was trembling a little, so she just took a deep breath and said, "Thank you, Nerdu." Ninja simply gently grabbed her shoulder and turned her to face him. Weiss. She looked at his face and saw his faint smile. It's okay to cry sometimes. And that was all it took. Her face wrinkled as tears spilled from her eyes, and she held onto him as tightly as she could, making sure her body had a source of comfort. Next day. He was brought in to be thanked, but as soon as they discovered the grim mask concealed on the dog Faunus's body, it swiftly turned to retaliating against the White Fang. He was standing in Mr. Schnee's office with Ironwood and a few adhesions. "I want something done, General. After my family was attacked, you can't expect me to sit here and give a thumbs up." One thing Nerdu appreciated about Mr. Schnee was that he was a family man, even though he might not express it in public. "And as I keep telling you, we can't do anything yet," Ironwood said, shaking his head. He groaned and sat down, saying, "But there may be a way if someone is up for it." The general gave the blonde ninja a stern look. Nothing has turned up about them until after the White Fang has done something. I'm at least willing to listen. Ironwood shifted his other leg and said, "Good. Honestly, it might not even work, but with those scars you can pass as a faunus, or at least a human who understands the plight they try to fight against." Nerdo could already see where this was going. "Admittedly, I thought you were a faunus until I saw you didn't have a single trait aside from the scars on your face, and from what you told me, they might just help us here." He was still technically a Hyde ninja village ninja, so the statement, "You know I'm not a legion, or in the military for that matter," was only partially true. "I understand, which is why I'm asking as a friend rather than as a military commander or even your instructor." And if it weren't for me, Bastard realized he couldn't refuse at this point. "Tell me where you need me, please. And let Weiss know I'll be returning for Reiter Palish next week." Apart from that, though, their little plan worked. He was inside the White Fang. It was actually an accident. He was traveling back and forth in the woodlands on his way to Vale to begin his search there when the train he was following came under attack by the very people he was searching for. It was a small group, surprising considering the company they were attacking, only about 5 of them, so he knew that, fortunately, there were no humans on board and it was manned and controlled by robots. He had no qualms about tearing them to pieces. He had the Biju create an illusion over his whiskers that made them appear bigger, more angular, and roughly 3 years old in order to give the tale he had in mind some degree of realism. When a teenager appeared out of nowhere, the White Fang members were obviously suspicious, but after seeing his face and realizing that he was shooting the robot knights with them, they decided to keep their blades out, which was made easier by the fact that they were losing before he arrived. When it was all over, they thanked him, but they continued to keep their blades out. He asked if he could talk to the current leader, and they all exchanged glances before nodding and wagging his head. They took him somewhere in silence for almost an hour, and 2 of the members stopped him from touching him since he couldn't smell it out. As the group entered the camp with a sacked person in tow, the sounds of conversation and eating were interrupted. While many people were curious about what was going on, none more than Adam Torres and his selected partner Blake Belladonna, who emerged from the tent they had just occupied to confront the group. "Someone explain," they said. Now, a member intervened to say that the task had been completed successfully. And truth be told, it was thanks to him. He glanced at Blake and gestured to the man on the hood. Blake slid next him. He assisted the crew, though it's unclear if he fully understands who they are. That and why. Torres agreed and instructed them to take off the hood, but he was a little upset to see that it was a human. He was going to kill the blonde sitting there when he looked up, and Blake shrieked behind him. Torres sighed and said, "Just this once, I'll hear you out." The blonde child had 6 very jagged scars on his face, 3 on each cheek, like whiskers, and they appeared to have only recently healed because they weren't fully sunken in his face. Despite his brutality toward humans, Torres still felt sympathy for those who were the victims of the racism they created. "My name is Nerd Uzumaki, and I used to support the White Fang by attending their rallies when I was younger. My parents found me one day and banned me from attending anymore. I continued because I wasn't going to listen. My companion, a fox faunus named Kara, was crippled by someone at one of the rallies. I lost it and began punching the man. All I can recall is the police showing there, and I'm in jail the following morning. Kara was injured by a free man, and she will never be able to walk again. They chose to imprison a child because he defended a friend, but they did nothing to the man. I was furious because it was so messed up. I was picked up by my parents, but since we moved, I was unable to attend another protest since I didn't feel secure without a companion. About 4 years ago, after moving to Atlas, I made several acquaintances that I believed would be fine. I made the decision to tell them about my previous time in the White Fang. They. His hands tightened and shook, and his breathing became labored. Being a member of the original White Fang before it got more radical, Blake looked to him with pity because he was somewhat like her. She stayed because of Adam, but she realized that he hadn't changed as she had thought. Adam, on the other hand, was thinking, this kid helped out before new management and paid a price not needed, but even with how they were now, he still sought them out. It was strange but not entirely unwanted. Sure, he wanted to make Faunus supreme, but seeing humans, even if only one helped them. Rwby, I'm reaching out to you, but I'm doing this because of a certain contract we currently have with someone else. I'm offering you a position with the White Fang. Blake was the only member in attendance who was astonished, but she was also pleased. But he's a human, said another member. He may be human, but he has the heart of a faunus, Taurus said, turning to face the woman. When we were powerless, few people would defend us, but he did. He sought us out, but now that we are powerful, people are afraid of us. I'm not sure if that was bravery, foolishness, or hope. However, I am aware that despite his humanity, he supports us and exhibits his faunus heart. Adam broke the ties and went behind Rwby, who was grinning with tears in his eyes. They had an elderly member to catch up with, so they pushed Rwby along and grabbed Blake on the way back to the tent. At that point, everyone was quiet. After 2 months, the White Fang were shocked that a human wished to assist rather than oppress them, but it didn't even take a week for Rwby to gain their respect. Since Blake was his companion on the majority of raids and spying missions, he had become close to Blake. Despite being constantly preoccupied with other soldiers, Adam still didn't fully trust Rwby, so it was unexpected that he had any faith in him at all. Perhaps because of his story or the sense that he was an older member, Blake had quickly become friends with Rwby. She was happy that he shared her opinion that killing needlessly is only necessary to incapacitate people, so she was taken aback when Rwby approached her one day and said, "Hey Blake, can we talk?" Being a healthy adolescent, she had read more spicy literature. In addition, because it was a full moon and her thoughts had already been racing about her new male partner, she naturally went straight into more lewd thoughts about the two. However, before she could finish those thoughts, she noticed his serious expression, so she crushed her fantasies and moved with him. Blake, do you think what we're doing right now is right? Rwby asked, turning to face her as they strolled a few minutes away to avoid being heard. Blake instantly clammed up. Naturally, she was thinking that even before he arrived. Now that she was confronted with the same question from a different source, she knew the answer. I used to think that it was yes, but now. She turned to face the forest floor. Rwby placed his fist out for her to bump after glancing at her and making a snap decision that, hopefully, wouldn't bite him in the ass. She fixed her gaze on him. What should I do? Just bump fists, damn it. After bumping fists with the fox and connecting her consciousness with his, the cat opened her eyes to discover that she was in an infinite, white chamber. Where are we? My mind. She turned to see Rwby. She looked back around the room, then back to him, but how? I need to show you some things and tell you the truth, the ninja moaned. Blake was more than a little perplexed. I'll start with the worst of it first. That story I told you, it wasn't true. God, you're going to really hate me for this, but I feel like you need to know. I actually kind of figured that. Blake sighed, not completely. Nerda blinked, your story was mine, but I didn't have a friend get hurt. I attended every protest, stand-in, and rally, but I never once saw your blonde mop. Please let me finish, Nerda said, looking down in sorrow, even though he could sense the betrayal in her tone of resignation. I'm here on a mission by the Elysian military to gather information on the White Fang, but after today, he said when she nodded in agreement. He shook his head. As I mentioned, my story wasn't entirely made up. I'm going to show you a recollection. Please understand that nothing can be changed, no matter how hard you try, she reluctantly gave a nod. And, okay, so I realize it's not canon/confirmed that Nerd had any form of physical torment made to him when he was younger, but for plot? Let's make it happen. K. Nerda snapped his fingers and brought up one of his darkest memories, of when he was 4 and didn't stay home on his birthday. Blake was about to intervene when Nerda reminded her that it was a memory, and she looked at his stoic face as the men left his room and carried on happily as if they hadn't just nearly killed a child and destroyed his mind. Blake watched in horror as they held down a child and sliced his cheeks open, just as they were on the outside world. They cursed him, called him a demon, and beat him with whatever they could find. Blake went back to him, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she gave him a hug. He held her tenderly for a few seconds before she retreated. Why, after witnessing it, she was at a loss for words. Because my friend wasn't lying either. However, his name is Nine Beast, not Kira. How about why how is he can it is it even dash Blake exclaimed, dropping her jaw as she turned to see the enormous fox towering over her. Nine Beast is a Biju, and I guess you could say demon that resides within me, Nerda chuckled lightly at her response, tossing her head back and forth between demon and container. We used to despise one another, but 8 months ago, a series of events led to our current state. Nerda glanced at his gigantic friend, who rolled his eyes, and said, yeah, whatever you sap. And I'm glad for it too. I was napping, so hurry up and go out. After Nerda laughed and caressed Blake's forehead, they vanished and then reopened to see the forest all around them. Blake turned to face Nerdu and said, Nerdu, you. He averted his gaze, anticipating the worst. You're just like the character in this book. After a few moments, the ninja looked at her and said, I'm glad you don't hate me. Blake moved a little closer and gave him a hug, saying, I don't think I even could. She backed off for a moment before turning back to the ground. And instantly lost his worry. In fact, he was happy enough to laugh, in which Blake soon joined. Do you recall our most recent mission? You mentioned that I shouldn't cover my ears because they were adorable when we were going. Nerdo blushed lightly, yeah, he remembered it. He felt his palm open and a ribbon fall into his hand. He looked up and saw Blake with her cat ears on display. Blake. I will make every effort to keep them out. All right? And the only reason we have another mission is because I lead Blake NRDO. Let's move. Adam had approached them, so Blake's confession would be interrupted. Blake sighed and turned to go back, but Nerda stopped him. She turned to face him and heard him mumble, sorry, before he hurried out of the clearing with the intention of going back to Atlas and reporting. The entire White Fang, including Adam, would be shocked in the next 5 minutes because, despite being new and human, they had been betrayed. They had no idea that this would be the last betrayal, so she closed her eyes tightly as she heard his footsteps echo out, counted to 10, and then ran back to camp because she had to maintain appearances at the very least. After a week. The following day, Nerdu went into Mr. Schnee's office and gave them the rundown of what had happened. General Ironwood sighed lightly and said, I see. Nerdu arrived at Atlas quickly, rested first, and then looked at the ribbon he had been holding onto the entire run before tying it around his wrist and falling asleep. I'm grateful, Nerdu. You'll also be pleased to hear that Weiss is excited to see you at Beacon, despite his mild annoyance with you. What are you saying? Although it appeared that Mr. Schnee was not overly excited at the mention of both schools and Crow, the general grinned and said, the perk of doing favors, my dear boy. I'm technically still enrolled at Signal and can't keep Crow from telling them to withdraw me. To put everything up, you might want to return to Vale. Ironwood went to Mr. Schnee and said, you know she feels for him, correct? HN. I swear you're just like the Uchiha he told me about, Ironsides grumbled as he started to walk away. When Naruto knocked on the door of the house he shared with Crow, Yang, and Rwby the following evening in Vale, a despondent Rwby opened it without even glancing at him. Hell, Lou? When they couldn't go get ammo for Crescent Rose, he told Rwby this pun because he hadn't told any to his pseudo-family since he arrived. Ironwood and Weiss quickly grew tired of them. Blake only laughed at puns about fish, and he hadn't told any to them since. Do you know what a lazy kangaroo is called? Still sad, she said, a pouch potato. She started to shut the door but halted. A potato pouch? She looked back through the open door. Narrow, the door almost flew off the hinges and smacked the wall as Rwby gained flight as her semblance and leapt at Naruto, almost knocking him down. You blonde dolt, Yang emerged and succeeded in taking him down. They got up and ushered him inside, saying, Look, you caught us just before we left. Rwby wanted to visit that dust shop, and I'm going to town to get more information about Mom. Would you like to accompany me? With a wink, Yang concluded, I'll let you ride on my lap. Yang arched an eyebrow and said, Or, I can take Rwby because I need to check something at the shop anyway. How do you plan on getting there? Yang said. The ninja smirked and pointed out the window. Up the street there was a white and orange motorcycle just like Yang's. How'd you acquire that? It appears to be an Elysian motor. They all got up to leave, I said, keeping in mind that I had an assignment from the general. This is just a portion of his retaliation for it. Whistling, Yang mounted her own motorcycle and revved the engine as it overturned. Milk it for all it's worth, Naru. She then rode off. After making sure Rwby held on, the ninja laughed and removed himself. Love orange as he might be, on Roman fucking Torchwick it did no justice. Naruto was about to keep looking around when he felt the bad intentions that the little group was putting out, and he caught sight of that damned orange hair. The door chime rang out, but he ignored it, thinking it was just another customer. This was the only funnest friendly shop in miles, and since it was late, he figured that they would be unseen. When he encountered Roman a few times while he was with the White Fang, he soon discovered that the orange-haired moron was not the mastermind Adam had been referring to, rather, he was too hot-headed and foolish to use irony. He was going to wait for them to leave before confronting them, but one of the goons approached him and Rwby, recognizing the suits as well. Damn it, Junior. You didn't become pseudo-siblings with Yang without finding the underground, which helped him, aside from the fact that Junior's bodyguards had attempted to make a move. He is a foolish romantic, but when you approach him and practically slip your leg over his thigh, everything falls into place. While Rwby was preoccupied with the music player he had given her, the sage slipped his hand behind his back and grasped the handle of the folded shingetsu. He stepped beside her and gave her a gentle shoulder bump to get her to look at him. She blushed slightly at their proximity before seeing his face. Hey children, raise your hands. I swear she's going to go deaf. Despite Ruby's much more sensible reaction, Nerd shook his head and said, I swear she's going to go deaf. They turned to face the goon. The sage sensed the displeasure as the goon's eye twitched. I told you to raise your hands in the air. Do you have a want to die or something? Are you robbing us? Rwby asked, glancing first at Naruto and then back at the goon. The goon waved his hands in a dumb motion. The girl nodded her head and a smirk grew on her lips. Oh my. As Roman leaned on the counter, he noticed one of the men he had gotten from Junior fly next to the others. He arched an eyebrow and sent another over there, this time with a gun, and when he heard him smash through the front window, he turned to face the group. A young girl wearing a red/black dress and a red hooded cape started to stand up, and the scythe she was holding on her shoulder started to extend. For a brief moment, Roman's heart trembled. It had to be a fucking scythe. Images of the only human to be respected in the White Fang flashed through his mind. He was on the verge of death, more than he liked when that blonde was around. Given that he had insulted his partner at the time, most would say it was justified. Rwby grasped her headphones and shut off the music after completely extending her crescent rose, spinning it a few times, and stabbing the point into the ground. End song. Roman sighed. He had a bad feeling, but if the queen didn't get what she wanted, he looked to the goons and said, "Look, get her." The rest of them fled, and just as he was about to pick up the dust to follow them out, blonde hair filled his field of vision, causing his entire body to tremble. In front of him stood that fucking blonde, dressed in his patented ninja sandals, a simple short-sleeved black cloak, a burnt orange shirt, and khaki cargo pants. Roman. You simply aren't sure when to give up, are you? The small agreement they had with the fawn was still running strong, but Roman was ready to say screw it all and go. Kid, what are you doing here? You should be returning with the bull and the cat, right? Nerda let a grin slip on his face. Oh God. Oh, so your small group was kept in the dark? That makes it more enjoyable, then. Not only did I fucking leave the fawn, but I wasn't involved with it at all. Roman then implemented FAR, fuck everything and run. I was doing it for a friend that someone there tried to strike against. Rwby had been taking care of the assistants while Roman and Nerdu were about to start talking. One of the men charged at her and swiped, and she used the weight of her scythe as leverage to heft herself up to the swing past under her. She then swung her body and dual kicked him in the face, sending him flying, using the momentum to pull Crescent Rose off the ground and land on the ground. The other idiots thought they could charge her because she had her back to them, but she saw this coming and used the other part of her scythe to shoot a bullet. She then spun and used the blunt end of the scythe's back to hit one of the goons, sending him flying into the air. Using the momentum from the swing, she continued to spin and smacked the scythe down onto another goon, creating a small crater from the impact. Rwby caught a glimpse of another goon brandishing a gun and preparing to fire, so she swiftly raised the scythe and her feet and fired another bullet, sending her flying down the street due to the high-caliber round's recoil. She had to do this twice more because the goon continued to aim just behind her, and on her final shot, she leaped in front of him and slid his feet out from under them, sending him flying. Rwby stabbed the scythe into the ground and used the momentum to swing around and kick the goon, nearly causing him to land on Roman. You were worth every cent, said Roman, who had just left the store and watched the goon drop close to his feet. You really were. He moved forward and let go of his cigar. Well, Red, I think we can conclude that this was a good evening. I even ran into an old friend. This is where we part ways, the criminal remarked, raising his cane to reveal that it was actually a barrel. As much as I would love to stick around, he said, pressing the end of the smoldering cigar out with his cane. After paying the owner for the window and apologizing, Nerda left the dust shop to witness the explosion and Roman booking it up a ladder. A blast of fire dust flew out of the barrel, forcing Rwby to quickly aim Crescent Rose downward and shoot again to avoid being hit in the explosion she knew was coming. When the proprietor of the shop emerged, Nerdu asked if he would be okay alone. As soon as aha was out of his mouth, Nerdu turned to Rwby and said, "Let's go, Rubes." The girl in red landed and saw her blonde companion come outside, but she didn't see the man she had just been shot at until she followed his gaze and saw Roman climbing like a monkey. The little girl he had to deal with called out to him as soon as he reached the top of the ladder, persistent. Lighter steps landed beside her, and the blonde stood next to her without drawing his own weapon. Nerda's ears detected the sound of a VTOL rising in the air, and he was right when one flew up beside the building in front of Roman. A spotlight turned on and shone on the two hunters in training. End of the line, Red, Blondie, the orange-haired moron said as he stepped on board the craft. He pulled a crystal of fire dust from his pocket, hurled it at them, skidded to a stop in front of Rwby, threw his cane up, and shot. Just as Nerdu was ready to use his scythe to deflect Rwby's explosion, a blonde woman landed in front of them, and smoke quickly obscured his vision. Wahaha! In front of the two children was a blonde woman who appeared to be a teacher, complete with glasses and a dress shirt, a writing crop held in her left hand raised. Nerdu recognized this woman. Crow had mentioned her and shown him pictures of her once, Glinda Goodwitch, assistant headmaster at Beacon. Nerdu glanced at Rwby and saw stars in her eyes. Roman stepped back with his laughter, but stopped when he noticed a purple pattern. We got a huntress. Roman grumbled and walked to the cockpit. The woman lowered her barrier and hummed softly, then pushed her glasses up and swung the crop back, letting a stream of purple arrow-like energies dash at the VTOL, most of which landed and sent the plane into a small frenzy to stay stable. The woman in charge of the VTOL had black hair and a loose ponytail that hung down to one shoulder and was dressed in a scarlet outfit with golden embroidery. As the huntress threw her arm down, a storm of energy formed from the area and started to rain large ice pellets onto the ship. Outside, Glinda built up some of her aura and shot it into the sky just above the craft. The woman manning the VTOL before walked to the opening Roman was at before, giving Nirda the chance to feel her power. What the hell? That reminds me of Rwby. The ninja looked at Glinda and saw that she narrowed her eyes, indicating that she knew this woman. Nerd refocused his gaze on the woman with Roman, and she looked at him. Her eyes resembled Danzo's, the ones that always plan ahead and try to think of everything. I guess this is Queen, huh? Before it was visible, Nerd sensed the energy of the woman on the ship began to form. The gold on her dress glowed like fire as a flame danced in her hand. She traced her arm briefly, threw her palm forward, and shot the fire at them. Glinda reacted quickly, erecting another barrier in front of them. Part of the flame appeared to turn to liquid at the last second and hit the ground. The woman raised her hand, and the roof beneath Glinda's feet lit up. Glinda twisted her arm in a circle and made a spear, rearing it back as if she had grabbed it and thrown it at the aircraft. The woman inside knew what was coming, though, and reared her own arm back and let loose a few streams that broke apart the construct. The huntress's back flipped as the spot she was immediately at exploded like a nova, landing next to the red and blonde kids. The falling debris stopped its movement as she stood up. AoE formed over the plane and blew the remaining debris away from it. Roman saw the spear coming for him inside and turned the craft so that the debris slid across the top of the roof and flew back in the sky in pieces, coming back together to form tendrils that encircled the plan. The woman inside the craft saw this and smirked lightly, crossing her arms over her chest, palms out, and throwing them back out when a strange seal formed around her body. Feeling a little excluded, Rwby started shooting at the woman with her weapon, but the woman inside easily deflected them with just her hand. She swung her arm out, and portals started to appear from underneath them all. Using the other half of his body, Nerd reached out and grabbed Rwby and Glinda, pushing them away from where they were, and Glinda landed lightly on her feet. The sage turned to watch the plane take off, the woman inside grinning at him as the door was about to close. He extended his hand like a gun and threw it back as if he had fired something. Behind him, a deformed skull materialized, and energy started to build inside its mouth. Glinda reacted with a medium level of surprise at the strange skull. Rwby, on the other hand, became excited. She loved the way his semblance worked. A weapon forming from nowhere? How could she not? Before the door closed, Nerd took one last glance at the woman and noticed that her eyes narrowed, but that smirk remained, perhaps even widened. He sighed as he lowered his hand, knowing that he would eventually get his answers. The skull opened its mouth and shot out a silver-gray beam that raced toward the ship, clipping its left engine and sending it into partial turmoil until Roman regained control and sped them off. Taking advantage of the quiet, Rwby said, "You're a huntress?" Glinda took her eyes off the blonde boy beside her to the redhead. Immediately Rwby went fangirl and a giant smile spread on her lips as she brought her hands up to her face. "Can I have your autograph?" As she sat in the police questioning room listening to the woman lecture her and Nerdu about becoming involved, the smile she had about 10 minutes before vanished. "The ex of you two have put yourselves and others in considerable danger." He laughed at Ruby's naive, "They started it," and pouted at him. "If it were up to me, you two would go home with a pat on the back," Glinda said as she walked past them and resumed. Rwby and Glinda grinned, but Nerdu remained stoic, knowing there was more. He was confirmed to be correct when the woman pulled out her riding crop and slapped the table, taking away both of their smiles. And a slap on the wrist, Glinda groaned and moved to a corner, saying, "But, there is someone here who wants to meet you both." Rwby yelled and withdrew her hand. A tall man with gray hair and spectacles emerged from the dark door wearing a uniform that resembled a greenish suit. He also carried a plate of cookies and a mug, which both Nerdu and Ruby's eyes instantly flew to. Nerdu already sensed that he knew who the man was. "Rwby Rose," he said, leaning down to look at her face. "You have silver eyes." Nerdu snorted, drawing everyone's attention, and the man's eyes widened slightly. Rwby felt a little uncomfortable, so she simply hummed. "So," the man began, "where did you learn to do this?" The gray-haired man stood behind Glinda, who was holding a scroll that was playing back the feat of Rwby fighting the goons. Nerda grinned at how much easy she had made it appear. She had come a long way from when she had been learning with him. Rwby looked at her companion and noticed the slight smirk on his lips. She nodded and replied, "S-Signal Academy." Glinda maintained her expression of stoicism, but her eyebrows were raised. The man, on the other hand, appeared a little more serious. "They taught you to use one of the most lethal weapons ever designed?" Rwby moved slightly in her chair and said, "Well, one teacher in particular." The guy nodded, "I see." Rwby reluctantly reached for one cookie and looked at Nerdu before trying to fit them all in her mouth while looking back at the dish. "Rubes. Keep some for me." When the man noticed that Glinda also had a smile, a small one crept over his face. "Simply put, I've only ever seen one other scythe wielder with that ability." Rwby grinned broadly and said, "I heard he had taught another, but I do remember only seeing that dusty old crow work like that." "Uncalled Ash Moo. I apologize, that's my Uncle Crow," she said, swallowing the cookies in her mouth as the gray-haired man laughed alongside Nerdu, whom she pouted at. "He works at Signal as an instructor." She gave the whistling blonde next to her a slight frown, saying, "I was garbage before he took me under his wing, but someone had a much easier time learning than I had. However, I'm like, wada, fo, now." She pretended to be performing karate moves while making noises, which Nerdu thought was adorable. After a moment of staring, the man said, "So I've noticed." He set down his mug and placed his palms on the table. "And what is it that such a lovely girl, such as you, is doing at a school created to teach warriors?" Nerdu would chuckle, but then he would recall how awful the academy was. The gray-haired guy glanced at Rwby and said, "Well, I want to be a huntress." The sage had not seen a serious Rwby in a long time. "You want to slaughter monsters?" She smiled slightly. "Yeah, Nerdu," she said. "And I only have a couple years left at Signal, and then we were going to apply to Beacon." The gray-haired man and Glinda's gazes went to the blonde, and he felt as if they were going to push him out of his seat. Nerdu knew she was about to start rambling as usual when she feels a little awkward, so he saved her by making her feel ashamed. The redhead blushed and slapped his arm, saying, "She believes that it's, in her words, extremely cool, super exciting, and super romantic." "Naru. Do you two know who I am?" Glinda asked, blinking stupidly a few times while the man gazed at them. He grunted. "You're Professor Ashbin, the headmaster at Beacon." Rwby lowered her head slightly but maintained eye contact. "Hello." Rwby smiled again. "Nice to meet you." Leaning slightly in, Ashbin said, "Want to see my school?" Rwby nodded her head. "More than anything." Ashbin glanced at the witch beside him and she grunted and looked back at Nerdu, who just blinked and smiled. The headmaster of Beacon chuckled a little. "Well, okay." Even though she felt awful about leaving Nerdu behind, Rwby's eyes and smile grew at that. She turned to face him and saw his genuine smile, which followed his brilliant dark blue eyes, which always made her think, getting off track, Rwby. "However, what about Nerdu? Rubes, don't worry about me, okay?" said Ninja looked at her. "I don't think I could get into Beacon anyhow, the way things are at school. Not unless it was all combat focused." It's true that his already enormous ninja skills made him a formidable foe, but fortunately, nobody there knew about it except for Crow, Rwby, and Young, and the Bijou, of course. Blake is aware of Nine Beast, fucking Kara, why that name? I wonder how she is now anyway. When he got to know Ironwood and Weiss better, he shared more of his past with them. At least he knew he would see Weiss, Young, and Rwby at B. Oh no, I realize I should have told them anything. Rwby glanced at him and said, "But Naru-Rwby, trust me, I'll be fine. I didn't want to break it here. If you don't think about it, it will appear even shorter when I visit in a few years. All right?" God, when he spoke to her tomorrow, she was probably going to kill him, Rwby said, looking down and nodding. Ashbin decided it was his and Nerdu's turn after noticing the conversation. "Miss, why don't you go home and prepare everything, Rose?" Rwby got up and nodded, hugging Nerdu before she left. When the door closed, the atmosphere of the room became tense. Glinda was standing at a much less relaxed posture than before, though Ojban was like normal. "You didn't tell her," the old hunter gave a slight nod, then took a sip from his mug. "Now then, Mr. Uzumaki." Ojban's eyes grew intense as the sage shook his head. "No, it'll be a good surprise for her when I'm on the ship with her." "How does the maiden's power feel?" "It's unbelievable that my younger sister will be accompanying me to Beacon." The sister was in Yang's death grasp. "This is the most amazing day ever." "But I'm so proud of you," Yang said after dropping Rwby and gently stepping in front of her while bouncing on her heels. Rwby let out a choked "please stop" since she was having trouble breathing. "Really, sis, it was nothing." "What do you mean it was nothing?" Rwby said glumly. Yang looked around and said, "Everyone at Beacon is going to think you're amazing." Rwby, who adored Yang but occasionally couldn't understand him, groaned, "I don't want to be the fad. Being knees of any type is not what I want. All I want is to be a typical girl with typical knees." "What's wrong with you? Are you not thrilled?" "I'm excited, of course. I simply don't want to come across as unique. Furthermore, it seems like we neglected Nerdu." Yang winced at that. She had been close to Nerdu, no doubt, but her sister was more attracted to him than she was. He and Yang were like siblings, acting nearly exactly alike, being all badass, enjoying practical jokes, and it seemed as though he was her from another dimension. Rwby, on the other hand, was with him more than Yang, had the opportunity to see him more than Yang did, and could tell how she felt. Even though Rwby was teasing, this was one topic she wouldn't bring up, at least not right now. Who should be left out? Both girls turned and saw the blonde they were just speaking of standing there with a smile. Ruby's face turned megawatt as she slammed into him. "Naru," he laughed and grabbed her. He looked up at Yang and saw that she was grinning, but it was a lighter one. Rwby released Nerdu, and he turned to embrace Yang. "I." They both said simultaneously, like the fawns. Even though Rwby was thrilled, she was frowning at him the next second, and Nerd had to swallow because of the obvious rightful rage. "Why are you here? Don't think I'm unhappy, I am, but what about Signal? How did you enter this site? When did you join this site? What will Uncle Crow think?" After a good start, she quickly became anxious and agitated. "Rubes," she said, looking up at him, "I'll explain everything when we get to Beacon, okay?" She nodded and gave him another hug, saying, "Just know that I am supposed to be here." The robbery was led by one Roman Torchwick. With a faint frown, Nerda stated, "That man is going to be a thorn in his side even more, especially after last night." "Back to you, Lisa." "Thank you, Cyril." Everyone looked at the screen on the airship they were in to see a mugshot of that individual. The screen cut and Glinda emerged. In other news, this Saturday's funnest civil rights demonstration took a dark turn when white fan members interrupted the event. Nerda shivered slightly, sincerely hoping Blake was out of there. Yang turned to face the woman and said, "Who is that?" Yang nodded slightly, "Oh." The woman and Nerdu spoke simultaneously. My name is Glinda Goodwitch." "Don't tell them the truth and they won't be prepared," said Nerdu, shaking his head slightly as the witch gave a brief introductory speech about how they were living in an amazing period of peace. When Glinda's hologram vanished, everyone fled to the windows, where the entire city was visible. Rwby pressed her face to the glass and said, "Look, you can see Signal from here." "Well, I guess the view isn't for everyone." Yang wrapped her arms around her sister and brother figure, saying, "Beacon's our home now." "Ugh, hi." They turned to see a blond boy drag his feet past them, coughing a little. Yang made a face and said, "Well, I guess the view isn't for everyone." Nerda pulled away to assist the other blond boy. Rwby turned to her sister after watching him go, saying, "Well, while it lasted, it was a pleasant moment." Yang muttered to herself, "I just hope they're better than Vomit Boy. Wonder who we're going meet." Her thoughts were interrupted when Rwby said, "Yang, you have vomit on your sneaker, which is disgusting." "Wow, what a grand total. Leave me alone, I don't want it on me. Quit." The student's airship had landed at the docking station for Beacon, and during the remainder of the flight, after helping the blonde kid out, he sat down in silence with Rwby and Yang. He had been thinking about his semblance, and the first thing he realized was that it was incredibly powerful. He had gotten it to work after becoming frustrated trying to mold the core energy in his mindscape. He remembered throwing his arms down and screaming in frustration. Saiken was about to console him when he saw the malformed skull form and had to move as the beam raced toward him. Nerda had apologized profusely, but it wasn't a big deal. He activated it the first time when he was angry, but he didn't want to rely on anger to fire it, so he trained to just make it from whenever he needed it to. After the entire Crow experience, when he nearly killed him, he gained a new ability from his semblance. It was strange that he had gained the telekinetic ability, considering there should only be one per person, but he was grateful for it when he saved Rwby and Glinda, even though they probably could have handled it. However, what did it signify? He acquired 2 new skills at the expense of all his core energy, and the Biju also lost theirs. The aura they acquired is what keeps them going today. Does that imply that when he connects with them, he will say, "Oh, look, there are my buddies, goodbye"? Apparently Yang had left them so Rwby can try to get some friends. It took her too long to make Summit's signal when he wasn't there. While not agreeing with Yang's method, he had to say that maybe this time it was effective. He could feel that someone's presence coming up. "I need to go talk to Ashbin, Rubes, see ya." "Hold on, Naru, not you alone. I don't know where to go or what to do." Rwby moaned and twirled in her seat, sliding back into a cart with suitcases after sitting silently for a while as he departed. After a few minutes of walking, Nerda heard an explosion behind him and knew it was Rwby. He felt awful about it, but she needed some experience without him. "Look, you both have questions for me that you want to confirm from Crow," he said as he arrived at Ashbin and spoke with Glinda. "However, I also have my own questions," Nerda said, feeling his aura, such as why there is a power equal to that of the woman we fought last night beneath the school. The headmaster turned to him and said, "I will explain everything after the introduction ceremony." Nerda nodded, he can wait till then. On the other hand, Ashbin continued, "We are actually tall one student." Glinda also seemed shocked, but she was also scandalized that some kid had been so rude. "Listen here, young Ma Glinda." She was interrupted as Ashbin took a step forward. "If we want his help, he can't be in the dark. Since you were, to be honest, somewhat planned and Rwby was added at the last minute. One team will have you as an additional member. I feel like the person who wanted Weiss dead will be right back at it, so I might as well simply place me alongside her at that point. Unless I use other methods, which I may describe later, power is simpler to feel than intent." As they made their way to the theater, Ashbin listened to him, "But I sensed some dark intent on the way here. We'll see if we can get you on Weiss's team. We are planning things differently this year than we were a couple years ago." When he spotted Yang and Rwby, Nerda fled the auditorium, but he changed his mind when he saw Weiss's white hair and the tense atmosphere around them, so he just stood off to the side, using the sound of Ashbin clearing his throat on stage to go by them. "Let's keep this short. You have come here today to learn, to refine your craft, to learn new things. And after you're done, you want to spend the rest of your life protecting people. But all I see when I look among you is energy that has been wasted. In need of direction or a goal. You think you'll be able to overcome this with knowledge, but your stay here will show you that knowledge is limited. It is up to you to take the first step," Ashbin said as he started to leave the stage after meeting Nerda's gaze. Glinda moved forward, aware that the two would be walking under the school. "Tonight, you'll all congregate in the ballroom. Your initiation starts tomorrow. Prepare yourself. You are fired." She soon joined the three. Rwby saw them walk up to someone in the back and when she saw who it was, called out to him. "Murda." As Ashbin and Glinda approached him and started to leave, he noticed that Weiss had widened her eyes and shot her gaze to him with a smile on her face. He mouthed a "we'll talk later" to her. Naturally, almost everyone heard Rwby's shout, especially Faunus. A certain black-haired cat who had tied a bow over her ears leaped up in search of him, but he had already left. After giving it some thought, Weiss said, "Wait, how do you know Nerda?" She looked at the little redhead, who started to feel small. Yang took over though, she said. I hope we know him because we lived with him for 6 months. When he initially came here, our Uncle Crow took him in. It's not a total falsehood. But Weiss was terrified. Nerda lived with them longer than with her? They must feel like family. I simply yelled at his young sister then. It was a reasonable assumption because she was unaware of their feelings for one another. So why didn't he bring you up? Rwby and Yang exchanged glances, and the blonde's thoughts were halted by one thing. Did he spend most of his time training? A nod. That's why, whelp. But the guy up there seemed kind of off. Yang straightened. That blonde idiot, when he gets training on the brain, everything else goes to black around him. Rwby went on for her. It's almost like he wasn't even there. John, the blonde vomit boy from earlier, had stepped in at that point, saying, I'm a natural blonde, you know. Weiss placed her hand on her head, asking why she had said anything. I'm not certain, but I might have a way to help her. That caught their attention. And how, Mr. Uzumaki, do you intend to do that? It was night now, and all the students had gathered in the ballroom. Nerd had gone down to the vault with Ajban and Glinda earlier to see her, Amber, the one who was supposed to be the current Fall Maiden. It appears that Crow was the one who discovered her being attacked by that lady from earlier. Putting his fists out, Nerda said, if Crow trusted you enough with the Fall Maiden, enough to where he told you some things about me, I can delve a bit more into it. They stared at him, and when he said, bump my fists damn it, they entered his head and silently gazed at the white expanse. Saiken, the six-tailed slug Biju, appeared in front of them. Glinda made a face, and Ajban simply blinked. As a hunter, he must have seen some shit. Saiken, who was always polite and formal, said, hello, Nerdu, Mr. Ajban, Ms. Glinda. I'm not sure. Even though we are relatively new to this world, I haven't had a chance to fully investigate Aura's capabilities and all of its attributes. Nerdu nodded sympathetically. Remember, we thought we had your semblance figured out until you gained that other ability. If I could make a clone, I'd let you use one, but I still haven't figured out how to do it. If I even can anymore, he said, taking a contemplative pose while Glinda and Ajban alternated off to the side. Normally, Biju core energy is corrosive. But it never hurt when Nine Beast and I were in tune. I'm curious if Saiken and I can still accomplish anything similar. Nerda continued to rub his chin, saying, I would try Nine Beast, but he's probably asleep, that and Saiken is a better healer overall. So it may not be now, but I might be able to help this Amber. I only need to raise Saiken and myself to a level 9 beast. However, that will require time. He glanced at the three in his mind and said, I think I may have a way, but I'm not 100% on it. He wasn't sure whether he had enough time. Saiken, do you believe your bubble's healing qualities could be helpful if we align? At the query, the slug gave a slight wriggle, Glinda yewing gently, it may be possible. However, that will require time. Will the woman be alright for a year or so? The two hunters appeared to believe that she would, so after admitting that they had a conversation about everything that required an explanation. When Nerdu entered the ballroom, he saw Yang glancing at a few of the males. Then, John appeared in front of her, got the U out of her mouth, and chuckled, attracting the attention of 6 people in particular. Hey, bro, come on over here. He had just changed, so he was wearing a basic orange shirt and gray shorts, while Rwby, who was standing next to her, was wearing a black tank top and pink sleep pants. He felt eyes on him, but they remained motionless, so he didn't acknowledge them, even though one set of eyes was extremely familiar. Yang also glanced over as he settled down next to Rwby and noticed her writing. What's that? This is a letter for the gang back at Signal, Rwby said, looking up from her writing. I promised to write to let them know how things were going. That's so cool. What dot? Rwby blushed, and her pillow touched the blonde girl's face. Stop talking. The redhead changed a little. Yang continued to smile, but what about John? He's nice. I didn't get to bring my friends to school with me. It's strange not knowing anyone here. There you have it, plus one companion. And rise of 100%. Rwby sighed and reclined on the sleeping bag. Yeah, but Weiss. When she didn't finish, Naruto gave her a raised eyebrow. What about Weiss? When I visited the auditorium earlier, you were both standing with her. Rwby flushed and covered her face, while Yang was laughing. Apparently, baby sis made them erupt. This time, Ruby's cat pillow came into contact with her face. Nerd shook his head and muttered, "Knew it. I knew it." The redhead sighed. Weiss is now viewed as a negative friend. Back to zero. Don't worry, Rubes, you'll become her friend in time, Nerd said with a small smile. Yang was less upbeat, saying, "Negative friends don't exist." Oh, perhaps he was wrong, you've just created an adversary. He went to Rwby and said, "Hey, look, it's only been a day." No, he was right. Please give it some time. Friends are here, you just haven't met them yet, Rwby said as she abruptly sat up and fixed her focus on someone. Yang and Nerdle looked at the individual, and Nerdu's heart skipped a beat. She left them. She left. He didn't hear Yang and Rwby talking anymore. He got up and began to walk over to her. Yang saw this and grabbed Rwby, "Notice? Come on, Nerdu is game." "Blake, you covered them up." She caught his scent, saw his face, and heard his voice as she looked up from her book. She was unable to breathe, she knew he was here, but what was she expecting, for him to completely ignore her? No, that wasn't him, even if the story he used to get in was a lie, his personality wasn't. She was about to ask how he was here when Yang's voice called out to them, "Hilu." Rwby wanted to be far away from here, yet she was still tugging at her. She moved between the two and shoved Rwby in front of her, saying, "I think you two could be acquainted." Blake looked away from Nerdu and said, "Aren't you the girl who blew up?" "That was going to stay forever," Rwby sighed. Yeah. She put out her hand to introduce herself, but Blake simply turned back to her book. Rwby withdrew her hand. This is not going well for Rube. When the sisters exchanged glances, he gave her a subtle, stealthy elbow. She raised her eyebrows, and he gave her the "at least try" look. The cat sighed and turned back to Blake, grinning broadly. "So, what are you doing?" Okay, Rwby and Yang were grasping at straws now. Blake stared at them for a moment, like she couldn't believe the blonde had asked. "Reading?" Yang averted his gaze. "Yeah, lost call, what's wrong?" Rwby had interrupted her. Blake looked at her, Rwby grinned at her. "What's the name of your book?" "Well, it's about a man with two souls." The reading girl lowered the book slightly. "Both fighting for control over his body." Yang looked a little strange. "Oh, that's real lovely." She turned to face the blonde male next to her. But Rwby went forward without seeming to mind, saying, "I love reading. Before going to bed, Yang used to read me stories." She looked up nostalgically and said, "Hero and monster stories are one of the reasons I want to become a huntress." Blake grinned, but it didn't seem real. "Why is that?" "Wishing you a lifetime of happiness?" "As a girl, I wanted to be just like the heroes in those books," Nerdu said in a whisper low enough for only she to hear. "Blake, come on, please try." Rwby didn't seem irritated, but she did say, "Well, I'm hoping we all will." She had Blake's attention. To stand up for what was right and defend people who were unable to defend themselves. That struck a chord with the sage. All of his actions throughout his life, even if they were done for recognition, were done to protect those at home, including the dwellings he built with the Wave People and the Sand Kids after he aided Gaara, and subsequently Hyde Ninja Village after he defended it from Akatsuki. Blake placed her book in her lap and said, "That's very ambitious for a child." She turned to look at Nerda's slightly frowned face and said, "Unfortunately, the real world isn't the same a fairy tale." Rwby was still not upset, in fact, she was grinning. "Well, that's why we're here, to make it better." Nerda grinned and said, "Oh, I'm so proud of my baby sister." The blonde girl gave Rwby a back-breaking hug, but the redhead didn't like that, so she delivered a punch that sent them both into a brawl. Nerd shook his head, saying that they behaved as if they were full-blooded siblings. Blake opened his mouth to say something, but was interrupted by another voice. "What's going on over here? Hey, you blonde dolt. Rwby held her sister's foot but released it when the heiress spoke to him. Oh wait, that's right, you know each other. Weiss looked at the sisters, yeah, and her eyes instantly turned sour as she stared back at him with anger. Even though he left, and I didn't find out until about a week ago. Naruto grinned up at her as Weiss approached in an off-blue sleep dress. However, I knew I would run into you again. I left Reiter Palish with you for that reason. Some mocking was in order. Speaking of, you were using it, weren't you? The heiress's expression brightened. How did you know? He asked, leaving just to assist her. Weiss shook her head and said, that's not why I came over here. She looked back at the sisters and said, don't you realize people are trying to sleep? Naruto cupped his chin and said, someone always knows when their weapons are used. Rwby cupped her own chin and nodded wisely. Nerd shook his head, saying, they were just arguing now, getting louder. He chuckled as he turned to face Blake, who was going to extinguish the candle, saying, this may be funny. She did so, and the three girls staggered over themselves, thunking and swearing. After Yang, Rwby, and Weiss had gone to sleep, he turned to Blake, who was still reading in the dark, nudged her a little, and gestured for her to follow him outside. The door creaked slightly, but no one was awakened, and neither of them was bothered by the cold. Blake turned to her former partner and asked, what did you need? However, she had a hunch about what he desired. You left, Naruto said, grinning at her. But you put another ribbon on them. She blushed a little and glanced down. What happened that made you leave? He said, wearing a pout. Adam, in fact, let out a sigh. Before you arrived, he had been acting differently. The Fong changed too quickly under the new administration, as if he had intended it to be this way. She sighed and leaned against the wall, saying, I considered leaving before you arrived. He became violent, and when we started attacking, he killed people instead of knocking them out. I believed he was changing back when you came and he welcomed you, even if it was because of those other individuals. However, that was shown to be incorrect. I knew I had the answer when you asked me that day if what we were doing was correct. Even though everyone was in the final few carts, I escaped the following day when he planned to blow up the train we were supposed to hijack. So how'd you get into Beacon? Naruto growled, that bastard. He was just as bad as Madara. Kill them if they're not useful. Did you apply as usual? Actually, I ran into Ashpin, Blake grinned. I immediately recognized him since we were trained on the types of hunters we may come across if we started acting more aggressively. I'm glad you're out of there, Blake, the ninja said, nodding his head before approaching Blake and giving her a hug. She stopped for a second before giving it back with some force. He offered for me to come if I gave him information about the Fong. They said, it didn't seem like that place suited you. Now come on, it's gonna be a big day tomorrow. They went back inside and bid each other good night. Naruto walked over to the sisters and patted their heads, then he went to Weiss and did the same. He had to suppress a giggle as she leaned into the touch. Since he and Saikan still had work to do, he eventually returned to his own sleeping bag and promptly dozed off.